response to that. Thank you.
Shall we take another one here?
Okay, right. Yeah,
and then we'll take three, and then we'll turn it to our.
Thank you very much. This is such a great conversation. One question I have is regarding the role of politicians to explain the complexity of the world. I think this has been a huge issue and which contributes to the discontent. Problems are very complex at this point, and it's very difficult for people to figure out what is the right solution to this problem. And many politicians, go for quick media talking points and snappy little, slogans here and there, rather than trying to really explain these complexities and why they've arrived at the solution that they want to put forward. So, yes, I would like to hear your thoughts around that.
Take David at the back.
Thank you also for conversation. My name is Toomas Luka. I'm also relatively new Estonian ambassador to Canada, and I survived my first winter in Canada, so it's already pretty good. But I would also like to, bring a perhaps different sentiment and to say I also old enough to remember times back away and new times. And I would like to say liberal is a way to go. And I would say that all nations who have opted for liberal democracy, and my own nation, have really benefited out of that. The question is how we can engage all society. And not being a politician, but as a citizen of my own state and traveling around a little bit, I think we need to get away with a notion of winning members of society, rich or middle class. We need to keep in mind also that not everybody is winning, but the question is how to really have a cohesive society. So first point is really to get away with that, to do away with winning or losing in one society. We want to really have a common society. Second issue that I picked up from discussion is that there are of course new trends, technology. There is artificial intelligence, and people have a legitimate sort of concern about it. For instance, AI, whether it's going to take away our working places or not, or migration compact, for instance. And in that respect, I think not only this probably lies with politicians, but also with everyone, media, scientists. The factor of we need to enlighten the people, teach them. And in this discussion, I didn't hear anything about the role of education. And I would think really to cut my speech short, is education is going to save the world. I want to have your comments on that. Thank you.
Okay, do you want to?
Shall I start? I think social mobility is huge, and clearly it's key. It's easy to diagnose, it's much harder to achieve, but I certainly think, picking up on some of the things we've already been saying, that we have to find ways of making people feel that they have a stake in our societies and in our economies. And it's complicated by things like technology. And we also have got ourselves in a position where those people who are doing jobs that technology perhaps can't do, for example, care of the elderly and nursing and things like that, we have maybe undervalued. And so I think we need a long, hard look at what roles in society we value and how we reward them and how we redress the balance so that there is a sense, first of all, that there is genuine social mobility. And education is, I think you can link all these questions together, because education clearly is a key part of that, because if you don't give people an opportunity to get a good education, particularly in our economies these days, then social mobility is not going to work. So you have to have that. So people feel, on the one hand, that they have the opportunity to advance, and that their children have the opportunity to advance, but also that not everybody will be able to become a tech genius, and therefore you've got to make sure that there aren't people, to coin the phrase, left behind, that people who are doing what might be classified by an economist as a kind of fairly menial job still feel they have a value and they have a wealth and a position in society that can also be a springboard then for their children. That's, as I say, easy to diagnose, much harder to do, and I have a huge respect for people that are willing to become politicians and commit to doing it.
Okay, well, thanks, Hugh. Yeah, so I agree with what Hugh has said. I do think, Ambassador, one of the things I like about what you said is not that people perceive the system to be unfair, but that in many cases it is unfair. And I think it's very important more broadly in talking about the concerns of the middle class, the hollowed out middle class. You know, people sometimes say, you know, their anxiety, their perception. This is actual reality. You know, there are real economic numbers around what has been happening to people in the middle class broadly across Western industrialized societies. And so we have to be clear about that. And one of the things that, you know, exactly as the examples that you cite illustrate, one of the things in the winner-take-all society is the winners help their children become super winners. And we are in danger in all of our societies of getting into a kind of Downton Abbey kind of effect. And I don't, you know, maybe you guys like Downton Abbey. I know you don't, Hugh. But, you know, speaking as a Canadian, we, you know, the ones of us who are not Indigenous who came here, a lot of us came here to get away from societies that were like that. So that's not the kind of society we want to live in. But I think it is really hard to push back against that. To connect my answer, you know, to Hugh's point about education and the final question, education is so important, and ensuring that access to education is very, very broad, starting, I would say, from junior kindergarten, is really, really essential. I brought a few little favorite quotes to read in case stuff came up. And one of my favorites is from a Doug Saunders column. He is a great Globe and Mail columnist. And in a column, a really interesting column he wrote about Brexit, he cited research by a University of Leicester scientist who found that the most decisive factor, I'm now quoting Doug, in Britain's Brexit decision was not the age or gender of voters, but their education rate. And this is quoting Doug, quoting the Leicester scientist. An increase of about 3% in the proportion of British adults with higher education in England and Wales could have reversed the referendum result in the UK. And Doug points out this wouldn't even require Britain to bring its higher education rate up to the levels of Canada, which is 10 points higher. You guys would only have to get 3 points higher. So I think that says a lot about this broader point, which is if we want to avoid the kind of really dangerous, divisive populism that Hugh has sort of, so magisterially described happening in a lot of the world, we really have a shared interest in making a lot of investments in our people. But it's, it costs money and it's difficult. And there are, we are going to be leaning against, I think, what is in part a structural winner-take-all force in 21st century capitalism. And just in conclusion, I want to address the question of complexity. Thank you for asking that question because I think about it a lot. And I think it is a really important one. In sort of thinking about our conversation tonight, I think my kind of Rosetta Stones were a pair of columns by your current colleague, my former colleague, and very dear friend, Martin Wolf. He wrote a couple of days ago, or a few weeks ago, maybe a column called The Rise of the Elected Despots. And then just today, he published a kind of a sister column to it, which is called The Politics of Hope Against the Politics of Fear. And I'm going to claim a little bit of credit for that second column, because after he wrote The Age of the Elected Despots, I wrote to Martin, I said, okay, now you've made us all really depressed. You have to at least come up with some of the answers. And so I urge everybody to read those two columns. They're really interesting. See advertisement for the Financial Times. And one of the points Martin makes is that modern society, you know, these 21st century problems we're talking about, are by their very nature complex. And they're going to require complex answers. And Martin acknowledges in his column that that is a hard challenge for liberal democratic politicians. And he points out, and I really agree with him, that it's tougher for those of us on the liberal democracy side, because if you're on the kind of, you know, everything is rotten, tear down the house side of things, you don't so much have to offer answers. You can just, you know, stoke up that anger and point out who the villains are. If you're in the business of kind of offering answers, it is hard. And I would be the last person to claim to have a definitive answer to how to do it. But I can tell you my personal starting point. And my personal starting point is Canadians are really smart. And I have a lot of faith in Canadians. I have a lot of faith in the people in my constituency. I have a lot of faith in Canadians across the country. And I really believe that it's okay to say to people, these are complex challenges we face. It's not so hard to imagine and portray the kind of world we want to live in, but it's a little bit complicated figuring out exactly how to accomplish that. And to say as a politician that what you can offer is to be honest about what the problem is, to be honest in your effort to work out solutions, and to be open and collaborative with Canadians about doing it. I think that's the best we can do. And I think Canadians know. And, you know, all the people of our countries, I think they understand these challenges are complicated. And I think we need to give people credit and be honest about that.
I'm conscious of the time and the clock ticking. Maybe we could take a couple more questions. Oh gosh. Oh, front and center is the High Commissioner, wherever the mic is. I'm sorry. Here first. I beg your pardon. Oh. Well, okay. So were you first? I'm sorry. There's a forest of hands. So we'll go to the Turkish ambassador, and then we'll go up front to the High Commissioner.
All right, thank you, Minister. Thank you for a very interesting conversation. I'm the new Turkish ambassador. You spoke about immigration. You know, we hold the world record with 4 million refugees now. Canada is very welcoming, but you have a very regulated immigration policy. I wonder what you think about the year ahead, especially if Idlib falls in Syria and 2 million more people hit the road and come to our country. I think that might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. How that would affect Canada and how you see immigration in the year ahead. Thank you.
And up front here, please. Where's the mic? Thanks, Mario. Yeah. Susan, sure.
Sorry, my Indian colleague come after me. I'm the British High Commissioner, and just to reassure you, I don't know what's going to happen next either. I want to ask you a question as journalists, as a former journalist and a current journalist. How far do you think the press can be at least held partly responsible for where we are? I think in the case of Brexit, there's a big question to answer about how, not in the honourable exception of the Financial Times, but as we know, not many of us read your wonderful newspaper, how far the press has led us to where we are. And second, what role can the press play in, or should play, in getting us to where we need to be rather than where we are?
So final question up front, the High Commissioner of India.
I am Vikas Swarup, the High Commissioner of India. So as we speak, the largest democratic exercise in history is going on in India, electorate of only 900 million people. And the biggest problem I think that we are facing in this election is fake news. So my question is, what do we do about social media? These closed echo chambers that have been created, fake news which circulates, which even leads to lynchings of people. I mean, can it be regulated? What can we do about it?
Yeah.
Sure, you have lots of journalist questions.
Okay, no, I was just wondering about the Turkish ambassador's question, not to forget that. Well, thank you. Why don't I kick off? I'm very glad, thank you for these questions, because I realized that I had not done my duty by coming back to the subject, but now you've allowed us to do so. So